Okay, every student, how are you? How was your stay? So, in the previous class, we have seen the first chapter, which is an introductory chapter for the research methods course. Now, we are going to see the second chapter, which is about the definition of statement of the problem. So, let's see now. What is a research problem or statement of the problem itself? So, research problem refers to the problem that someone would like to investigate, a situation that needs to be addressed or changed. So, when a researcher undertakes defining the research problem, that is like a medical doctor examining the patients. So, a research problem in general refers to some difficulty which a researcher experiences or sees in the context of either theoretical or practical situations. So the problem statement has the following characteristics. So the problem statement is the guiding idea of your proposal, and this statement of the problem presents the research questions as well as the research objectives. And when defining your research problem, you shouldn't leave any room for ambiguity, and your research problem should be clearly stated, and you have to articulate it well. So this statement of the problem contains the need for the research, and it should be stated so well, as we have already said, and it should be self-explanatory. Always the statement of the problem should be self-explanatory. What do we mean by this? Self-explanatory refers to anyone who understands English could read it, understand it, and react to it without the presence of you. So anyone who can read and understand English should read and understand your statement of the problem. That way it becomes self-explanatory. And the statement of the problem must be researchable, and it must lend itself to empirical testing, and it should be specific as well as fact-oriented. What are the points you have to consider in selecting a problem specifically? So one thing you have to check is whether you are well equipped in terms of your background. You need the knowledge to undertake the study. So whether you have the knowledge or not, you have to check. And the second thing is whether you have the budget to undertake such a study. You have to consider this thing. And the third basic thing that you have to consider is the cooperation of various stakeholders. So whether there is a cooperation or not should be checked. So these are the points that you have to consider in selecting a research problem. When actually defining the problem, the definition of research problem should be given at the beginning of the study. That's why we say defining research problem is the first and foremost step in research. And what are the components of a research problem? These are the components. One thing, you need to have a group or individual with a problem. Then out of that definition of the problem, you have to identify objectives. So objectives to be attained are the other components of a research problem. And the third component of a research problem is the means to address the objectives. So alternative means for obtaining the objectives is the other component. And the last component is about doubt in selection of those alternatives. So what are the necessities of defining the problem? Why we define the problem? So defining the problem helps in this way. It helps you to identify the data that you are going to collect. Which data is relevant or not will be identified through the definition of the problem. And what characteristics of data are relevant and need to be studied? These questions are answered through the definition of the problem, as well as what relations are to be explored and what techniques are to be used exploring relations. So in general, the research defining the problem helps you to discriminate the relevant data from the irrelevant ones. What are the techniques involved in defining a problem? The first thing that you have to do is to state the problem in general way. So in addition to this, you have to have some kind of field observation. You have to undertake some sort of preliminary survey or pilot survey should be undertaken to clearly understand the problem. And in addition to all of the above, you need some kind of support from experts in the field. So in defining the problem, what you have to do are this one. Next to this, then by doing this, you can understand the nature of the problem, and again you have to survey the available literature so as to better understand about the problem. And after all of this, you have to develop the ideas through discussions. You have to discuss with colleagues or other individuals. And the final thing after all of the above steps, the final thing that you have to do in defining the problem is to rephrase the research problem into a working proposition. What are the considerations in selecting problems for research? You have to avoid overdone subjects. Some subjects are overdone, so those subjects should be avoided. You have to go for new things. And the other consideration is to avoid controversial subjects. So some subjects are controversial by their nature. So for average researcher, you have to avoid controversial subjects. Again, you have to avoid too narrow or too vague problems. Too narrow problems should be avoided, as well as too vague problems should be avoided. Select familiar and feasible subjects. Consider your qualifications. The costs as well as the time factors are the other considerations in selecting your problems. Source of the problem. From where do you get the problem? How do you identify the problem to be studied? These are the sources. One thing that helps you to identify the problems is reading. While reading various books as well as research articles, you can come up with some kind of problems to be studied. And academic experiences, lectures, class discussions as well as seminar discussions as other sources. Daily experience in your life, you may experience some kind of problem, and you can take those problems into study. And exposure to field situations as other sources. Consultations with experts as well as researchers helps you to identify the problems to be studied. Then brainstorming, discussion with interested persons as well as researchers. Further, the prior researches suggests further research areas. So from prior researches, you can identify your problems as well as intuition, personal intuitions. Intuitions may come to your mind, so that on the base of your intuitions, you can go for studies. So these are the sources of the problems. A research question. After the definition of the statement of the problem, the next thing that we do is to pose a questions. A research question is the researcher's translation of the problems into specific inquiry. So the goal of defining the problem is to state the research questions clearly and to have well formulated hypothesis. Then after posing the questions, then you have to clearly identify the objective of your studies. The research objective is the researcher's version of the business problem. Once you have identified the research questions, then you can go for the research objectives. The research objectives explain the purpose of your research in terms of measurable and definable standards. Objective of the study, we have two types of objectives. One is the general objective and the other is the specific objective. So the specific objectives indicate a specific type of knowledge to be produced and certain audiences to be reached. And the quality of any study is measured against the quality of the specific objectives. The objective of the study should be SMART. So what do we mean by SMART? S refers to specific. The objectives should be specific. The objectives should be measurable. The objectives should be achievable. The objectives again should be realistic. And the last T refers to time boundedness. We need some kind of time bound. So the objective of the study should be SMART in this way: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bounded. So let's see an example on how to frame your general objective and a specific objective. We are taking one example as a students of accounting. This is a topic which is relevant to you. So title of the study, this is an example. So the title of the study is Determinants of the Profitability of Insurance Companies in Ethiopia. So from this title, our problem in this case is to identify those factors which determine the profitability of Ethiopian insurance companies. So we define our problem accordingly, and after defining our problem, we have to go for identification of the general and the specific objectives. The general objective is more or less similar to the title of the study. So let's see. The general objective of this study becomes: the main objective of the study is to investigate the factors that determine profitability of insurance companies in Ethiopia. So in order to address these general objectives, what we are going to do specifically, we have three specific objectives. By the way, specific objectives should be in number, in terms of number, they should be from 3 up to 5. It shouldn't be beyond 5, and it shouldn't go below 3. So here we have 3 specific objectives for our study. So in this case, our specific objective, the first one is to examine the firm specific and the macro specific factors that determines profitability of insurance companies in Ethiopia. Then the second specific objective becomes to scrutinize the macroeconomic factors that determines the profitability of insurance companies in Ethiopia. And the third one is to identify the industry specific. So in the first case, we identify firm specific factors. In the second specific objective, we identify macroeconomic factors which determine the profitability of insurance companies. And on the final specific objective, we identify the industry specific factors. So in this way, we frame our specific objectives for our study purpose. In all of this, in all of our endeavors in research, we have to consider ethics. What are the ethical issues of research? So one thing is the information confidentiality. So the information, as a researcher, you are going to get information from various sources. So those sources may need their information to be confidential. And the ethics of research also requires you to keep those informations confidential. So you have to keep the informations that you collect confidential. And the other thing that you have to do in conducting research is you have to voluntarily involve people. Voluntary participation should be considered. You have to participate individuals in your study on the basis of voluntariness. So you shouldn't use some captive audiences in this case. You have to tell about the objective of the study. You have to ask whether they are voluntary or not. So on the basis of voluntary participation, you have to consider, you have to undertake your studies. And the other thing is the informed consent. Some kind of studies may involve risks, either physical risks or psychological risks. So if there is any kind of risk which could happen to those involving in the study, you have to tell. You have to tell the risks, whether it is physical as well as psychological. You have to tell to the participants. You have to inform them clearly. These are the things that you have to consider, from the definition of the statement of the problem up to the up to the final report of your studies. So in today's class, we have seen about how to define the research problem, the necessity of the research problem definition, and as well as how do we pose a research question and how do we convert the questions into research objectives, and what are the ethical issues of research is what we have discussed in today's class. On the next class, we will be discussing about further issues in research method. This is all for today, and see you next time.